Welcome to Cross Connections, Season 2, Cover to Cover, as we read along with you each week and discuss the Bible from Genesis to Revelation. Join us as we discover how these stories connect us to God, to our inner selves, and to one another in a world that tries so hard to disconnect us. Well, welcome back, folks. Here we are in our second episode of our reading reflection, and we are, you should be most of the way through Genesis at this point. Now, we are expecting in next week's episode something special. We want to kind of get to Exodus. So while our reading plan did not ask you to read all the way through the very end of Genesis just yet, we are going to kind of talk through about that far, just to give you a heads up on where we are and where we're going today. So here we are, second half of Genesis. We are well into the story of this family.
Yeah, so like we have a huge shift of focus. The first half of Genesis was on the whole earth. The whole earth is created. The whole earth is flooded. Everyone goes out and has all of their languages. And now the focus shifts to a family. And so sometimes we call this the patriarchal history.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there's a shift to, you'll catch throughout all of these chapters and all of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, all the way down to Joseph. There's this constant refrain of God's promise and the promise that he made to Abraham of, I'm going to bless you. I'm going to give you a land. If you notice, it's really concerned with descendants, as numerous as the stars of the sky or the sands of the sea. So you see that continually reiterated as this kind of through thread through all of these patriarchs, as God is doing something particular with a people, to reiterate your point, Rick, that it's not this big cosmic vision, but it is in the sense of it's moving out from a people to the world. But that's jumping ahead.
The world's there. Like,
right.
I mean, he tells Abraham, I bless you that all the nations of the world would be blessed through you. And so we haven't forgotten the whole world, but the focus of the story is on this one family. Yep. That, spoiler alert, next week when we get to Exodus, it won't just be a family anymore. Now this family has turned into a nation.
Yep. Right.
Right. Yeah. But so right now we're still in this very specific family. We're with Abraham and Abraham's descendants, and there's some very specific things that you notice they're starting to be careful about, like who they marry. Mm-hmm. What kind of a person are you looking for? Where are you looking for a person from? Elliot was pointing out just before we got started, when Abraham goes to find someone for Isaac to marry, he doesn't want Isaac marrying somebody from Canaan where they've settled, and he sends his representative out back to where he himself came from to look for somebody like from his household, and ends up finding Rebecca, who I think his grand niece is what I came up with. So Rebecca would be Abraham's grand niece.
Wow.
And man, I will say, if you are a listener and you're anything like me, you mix together all of these patriarchs and who they married and and when it happened and where. But correct me if I'm wrong. I have a suspicion I'm wrong on this one. Is it Isaac marries Rebecca, right?
Isaac marries Rebecca.
This is not Laban's daughter. That is with Jacob.
Laban's sister. Rebecca is Laban's sister. And Laban's daughters are, Jacob's. Yes.
Okay.
Leah and Rachel. Which also, when you have Rebecca and then you have Rachel, like sometimes that.
Because when you get to Jacob, he is effectively marrying his cousin, right? That's what's happening? Right?
I think approximately. Now again, I mean, I could sit here and I could do the whatever
tree,
removed,
remember,
but
like what we were talking about before this is that we don't want to intermarry with the other people.
Yep.
Right.
So we want to, they're trying to keep it
in the family.
I was trying to find a way not to say that,
but it is what it was.
But
and we will later see that play out in Israel when they make the way into the promised land, and there's other people already living there.
Yeah.
That not only are we going to conquer them, but we are not going to intermarry with them.
Right.
And so we see that reflected here.
Right.
Yeah.
In fact, it is almost certainly the case why it is reflected
Absolutely.
here is as a
Precursor.
teaching lesson of like
Right.
when
we
they
haven't been doing this for a long time, so don't you start doing it now.
exactly.
I mean, they did try to keep it like, so, we're not seeing siblings here.
No.
But we are seeing, like a couple removals.
This is kind of in the weeds, but I do want to make a theological point here that this is a reminder that we have to be very careful reading these ancient texts and thinking of them very simplistically of like, oh, these are lessons and morals for how we should live our lives.
So, yeah, I mean, clearly, and the patriarchal families are not the Sunday school families
Yes.
that like we just want everyone to be. I mean, they are presented as these very flawed characters. I mean, Abraham is passing off his wife as his sister, and
Isaac does it too.
I mean, Judah goes off and
Sleeps with his daughter-in-law.
Oh,
Because-
he
and then
thought
wants
she
to
was a
kill her.
whore.
because she thought she was a prostitute. So,
I mean-
that's fair, right? Like, these are not the moral exemplars that.
Oh, and Reuben ends up sleeping with his father's concubine. I mean, I
Yes.
guess
Yep.
maid, concubine,
Yeah.
whatever.
Yes.
Rachel's.
So
but one of his
these
wives.
are not these stories like, oh, we just want you, little Timmy and Susie to be just like them.
No.
Like
Right.
No.
the patriarchs are not the examples
Yeah.
for how we are to live, but they are an example about how God absolutely works through flawed vessels.
Right. And is involved with flawed people.
Yeah.
That you do not have to be a shiny, perfect, pure person.
And finds ways to redeem some of the mess.
Because you could see a scenario where the biblical authors would choose to not present the patriarchs of our people in this way, and you could let's just brush some of this aside. Let's whitewash some of this and just clean up some of this and just talk about them as, sort of like how we talk about George Washington here, right? He never told a lie and he chopped a cherry tree down. Like we could do that with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but the biblical authors did not do that. They told a very raw story of a very real family.
Yeah.
And I think that's what makes it relatable in some ways. Like, okay, these are real people.
Yeah.
And also in some ways very foreign to our context. I mean, I'm thinking of how our week's reading this week started with Genesis 22 and came out swinging with Abraham going to sacrifice his son Isaac.
Whoa.
And that's a tough story. Not something I've ever had to think about. I didn't grow up thinking, Father, are you going to sacrifice me at some point? I don't know. I'm curious about y'all's thoughts on maybe that's one to gauge your reaction to that story.
So much ink has been spilt over that story, and what exactly does it mean? And
I got caught up in who asked him to do it, because in my text, the language kept changing as to wait, so did God ask him to do this, or did the angel of the Lord ask him to do this? And what's the difference between the two?
Yeah.
It shifts, the language shifted and changed, so that also threw me.
Huh.
It is probably important to say here, there's a lot of ambiguity in the Hebrew scriptures about what the angel of the Lord is.
Totally.
In fact, some interpreters would maybe say it is the manifestation of God. It's not like this separate entity. So there's a little bit of question of is it something other than God? Is it God in some form or manifestation?
And the Hebrew scriptures are really specifically vague about this. And God does show up in different ways. And it's not theologically reflected upon in the text.
Right.
So in the story, when the three visitors go and visit Abraham and Sarah, it says the Lord went, and then in the next sentence, it's three young men.
Yeah.
Okay, well, is it the Lord or is it three young men? And the answer seems to be yes.
Yes.
Right.
Just yes. And then and then you have the angel of the Lord. A little bit later in the Hebrew Bible, we'll have the glory of the Lord, the Shekinah, and again, there's no and this is an emanation of God or a mode of God. Like it doesn't do that.
No.
It just throws it out there. It's the angel of the Lord.
Yeah.
It's the glory of the Lord. Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's what's just funny. I came across another example of it. I read ahead a little bit, and at some point early in Exodus, it says something about the Lord said something to Moses, and God also said something to Moses. It's like, wait a minute. What do you mean the Lord said something and then also God said something? Is this two different? Anyways, so the ambiguity is there, and so that makes it a little like, what exactly is happening here, and why is... So big picture theologically, I get that what's going on here is God is asking Abraham to do something really huge, kind of like a way of testing to see whether Abraham's really committed to God. We'll see later that God is asking people to follow, and it seems like this is that moment of like, are you really going to follow when I tell you to do something?
Right. And the answer is no. Because the people constantly, from the patriarchs straight on through the rest of the story.
Well, but Abraham Abraham was going to follow through, you know what I mean?
Okay,
and it was only because they stopped,
Isaac.
right? You know what I mean? Like Abraham with Isaac. That's what I'm saying. Like
all
this
in
was
that day.
Yeah.
Well, it is a little bit complicated because there's this weird moment in the story where Abraham says, like, oh, don't worry, there's going to be a ram provided. God will provide a ram, which is very interesting because there's so many ways interpreters have read this. Rick has talked a couple times about midrash, and I think this might be one of the stories with the most voluminous midrash. Like volumes and volumes of Jewish interpreters have written on this, Christian interpreters have written on it, and there's so many questions. One is that question of, did Isaac really believe that he was going to have to sacrifice his son?
Abraham,
excuse me. Another one is, how old was Isaac? Which I think is really funny. The text never says. We often picture him as a child, but a lot of Jewish midrash actually will say Isaac was an adult. He was in his 30s or 40s.
Well, I mean, he's got to at least be a teenager if we're tracking from the previous set of scripture.
Yeah, I mean, but there's just no telling. It doesn't actually say.
He never tells his wife what he's doing.
He never tells his wife. That's another
he goes
component.
Off to
There's
sacrifice
no
his son
way
and just like
that Sarah would have been.
There's actually a lot of Jewish
way,
midrash that Abraham and Isaac had a conversation about it on the way. So that's a way of reading the story, but there's just not a lot of details.
And then of course, Christians will later reflect on this story and say this is a prefiguring of another father who will actually have to go through and sacrifice his son, and that's God with Jesus. And so there's like a Christian interpretation and understanding of the story, which goes back pretty far.
In fact, I think it's Romans 8 where Paul says, what's the line? Something along the lines of, and God who did not spare his only son.
Yes.
And there's a lot of readings of that and the background of that, arguing that Paul was explicitly thinking about this story and drawing on Jewish interpretations of this story.
So you say that, and I'm going to shift our gears slightly, because as I was reading it, when God asks Abraham to take Isaac, he very explicitly says, your only son. Mm-hmm. But later in the scripture, Ishmael's still in play here,
it's not
folks.
His only son.
It is not. It's very clear that Abraham still has Ishmael. Like Ishmael's still acknowledged as Abraham's son. Both Abraham and Isaac are present to bury Ishmael and Isaac are present to bury Abraham. Yep. So I just thought that was really interesting, that it's like your only son, but not really.
There are details that the scriptures just are not interested in. And like I've been asked a bunch of questions in the last couple of weeks as people have been reading the Bible, and they're usually very specific questions. Like in this verse, like why didn't this happen? And my answer is generally, well, we just don't know that the scripture. It's an interesting question. The scripture was not interested in answering that question.
Right. I, if anyone remembers, I think this might have been in last week's or one of the teaser episodes, I talked about especially Genesis being a hot medium, and that idea that there's lots of space for filling in our own kind of imaginative, what happened here, how did it happen, what did it look like? And that is so true of Abraham and Isaac in a way that is almost more than any other story here in Genesis.
I know I said in the last episode that the early chapters of Genesis are kind of dreamscapey. This is dreamscapey in the same way. Like if I woke up like, oh my gosh, I had a dream where I almost sacrificed Zoe right on top of a mountain. You guys would be like, what?
Yeah.
Like, what happened?
Right.
Oh, but I don't have any details on it. Right.
There was a ram.
And in the dream, I didn't tell Karen that I was going to take Zoe and sacrifice. Like,
oh my goodness.
Yeah, it is very dreamscapey. Well, what are some of the other big moments from the end of Genesis here?
Well, so we talked a little bit about, finding the right person for Isaac to marry. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I noticed about that moment was, I think last week we talked a little bit about the importance of hospitality in a few spaces. Mm-hmm. And it comes up again here when Abraham's servant goes back looking for somebody from Abraham's wider family as a wife for Isaac. He's specifically hoping to find somebody who will respond with openness and generosity when he asks for a little water, somebody who's going to not only provide some water, but also go the next step of watering the camels and inviting them in. And that is exactly what Rebecca does. So I just think it's really interesting that that hospitality was a really a big priority.
Yeah, that's a great point.
So one of the major themes that I think is sort of related to that is the theme of things being unlikely and all of the trouble that the patriarchs have conceiving. Right?
Rebecca had a really tough pregnancy with those twins.
And then the heartache that happens because there's usually another woman that's brought in and they have a child with that, just as you do, right? And yet a child does come forward.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I was reading something recently, and this is not necessarily here or there, but that the biblical perspective was that barrenness, it was only possible for the problem to be with the woman. I don't know if you've ever thought of this.
I've definitely.
Right? I'm sure you have now. I gotta say, I had never really considered this before modern times. I mean, you think of Henry VIII, right? Mm-hmm. There was no conception that barrenness could be a result of the male involved, and so it's really interesting that throughout these stories, it is written from the perspective of it is always the woman who is barren. There's a problem with her womb. So it's just interesting that you don't get this perspective that, the problem was that Isaac couldn't conceive and he needed to pray and have that. Because that was not even understood as a possibility in ancient times.
Right.
So don't make of that what you will.
Because all the action happens inside the woman's body. So, I can kind of understand where that assumption comes from.
Sure. Yeah. Well, and the idea was that all that happens with a woman is that it is a receptacle. And so if there's a problem, it's a problem with the receptacle, which I thought was fascinating. I had never considered this. Really, I read this must have been a month ago, and I was like, it was like a light went off. I was like, oh my gosh.
And the only time that we've seen, at least thus far, where it's the man's fault is in the situation with Judah's sons, where the second son didn't want to. Onan did not want to try to provide children for his deceased brother, and therefore spilled his seed, as it were. Like that's the only way in which
we're going to keep this PG.
I just said spilled seed. I didn't say anything.
That is what the Bible says. Further. You're repeating the very words of God. That is right in there.
But yes,
Rick is cringing.
Lots of there's a lot of pregnancy issues and stuff in this.
The Bible and the narratives here in Genesis and Exodus are very much R-rated. The things that are happening here cannot be sanitized.
No.
Really,
No, you get to Dinah.
Dinah, Tamar.
I had my Old Testament professor in seminary. She's one of the editors of the New Oxford Annotated Bible. She said that as a child, she grew up in a very conservative Christian family, and she was only allowed to read the Bible. And so she, you see where this is going.
This is very ironic.
She's up at night, like with the covers over her head, reading the Bible with a flashlight. because like it's juicy. It's, again, this is not like, oh, these are the people we're just supposed to emulate, right? Like,
it's a little more complicated than that. Right?
Well, and like Esau has some really nasty wives. Like I'm feeling like all Real Housewives of.
And there's some real human emotion, like to switch gears a little bit. I think one of the things that struck me on this reading that it's not that I had never noticed it before, but I just don't think I took the time to let it really hit me and stand out to me, is a lot of the weeping that happens throughout these stories. And I just found that language fascinating because it is literally using the word "and so wept." Yeah. And one of them is when. I think it's one of the most beautiful passages from this week's reading was when Jacob and Esau reunite. Gosh, where is that? It's around 32. 32 and 33.
Jacob's been avoiding him this whole time. He's sending everyone ahead. He's and finally they get there, and there's this like
and he expects Esau to probably try to kill him,
take all the stuff,
kill his family, and it's the verse.
You see him projecting what he feels like he deserves.
His guilt, his shame,
the shame of what he had done, and it's chapter 33, verse 4. And it says, and actually it reminded me of the story of the prodigal son. It says, but Esau ran to meet him and embraced him and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept.
Yeah.
And that really struck me. And then later they say, I thought this was one of the most beautiful lines. Jacob and Esau are talking, and Jacob says, for truly to see your face is like seeing the face of God. Yeah.
There's those little moments where it's just like,
yeah, I mean, almost novelistic, right?
Yeah.
I'm thinking of that story of your professor that would read this under the covers of these moving stories of human emotion, weeping. To see your face is to see the face of God. The same with the Joseph novella at the end, which we can talk more about. Of Joseph weeping. There's these moments where Joseph. It says he has to leave.
He's weeping.
I have to leave the room.
Handle it.
I have to leave the room so I can weep. And like you said, I'm glad you brought up shame with Jacob. I mean, these moments of shame, of depression. You can imagine anxiety.
Hagar. The story of Hagar. Her name literally means foreign thing.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
And she, has this child, and she sets him out into the woods to die of exposure, and then God sees her and speaks to her and is like, no, like a great nation's going to come from him, and it's all going to be okay. And then she names God as the God who sees. Like, so even in my pain, no one else saw me, but God saw me.
Right.
Well, and God sees a lot of people when we. So sorry, I was thinking about the weeping and how beautiful that was, and Jacob's guilt. And you don't early on necessarily get that Jacob has guilt for tricking his brother out of his birthright, and then with his mother tricking him out of the blessing. You don't get any sense really of guilt for any of that. It's more like fear that he's going to get him early on, and why he takes off. And it's almost like he's matured to the point of realizing his like, maybe that wasn't so great. But there's a lot of there's weeping, and God steps in those moments. You see that a lot as we were talking about the pregnancies and the births with Jacob's wives. Leah being the one who's not loved, and God sees her and remembers her. And then later, much later, as Rachel's gone through everything and tried so hard to bring a child in, and then God finally remembers Rachel too. And
that's a good point. Yeah, you see a lot of this language, and we'll get to talk about this with Rabbi Green in our next episode, which is going to be amazing, about the Exodus. But the language of God remembering people. God remembers Israel when they're in Egypt, and like I think you just said, God remembers Rebecca and acts in a liberatory way on their behalf.
And sees people who are in pain.
Yes.
And so it's not, this God does not just choose the wealthy, the powerful, the important.
Right.
we were talking about this before we started recording about the reversals. Like it's not,
Yeah.
it doesn't seem to be really good to be the firstborn son in the second half of Genesis.
Well, not
because-
even in the first half. I mean, well,
right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because Abel was preferred over Cain.
Right.
And that's
And-
part of why Cain killed him.
Culturally, we know that the firstborn son was given everything.
Yep.
Like
Right.
everything.
Yeah.
And yet in the scriptures, that's not true. It's almost always the second born that is, and so it's this God sees the second born. This God sees the foreign thing. This God sees the one in pain. This God sees the nation that's a slave nation, and God chooses to enter in relationship with the people who aren't always winning.
Yeah. Yep.
And you hear that pointed out and reflected later in the Gospels about, who God is and who God sees,
The first
the
shall be
widow and the
last.
outcast, and the first shall be last.
The last shall be first.
And the last shall be first. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, and it continues with Mary and the Magnificat there.
Oh, the great reversal.
Yeah,
of
the great reversal. It's quite a theme.
the
throughout all
stone
of
that the
Scripture.
builders
Yeah.
rejected has become the chief cornerstone.
Yeah.
Right. So don't when you're looking around in your modern day, consider like who's looking a bit like a firstborn and who's
Yeah.
not,
Yeah.
as it were.
And when you feel like no one sees you, no one cares about you, no one
Right.
no one has your back. Actually, the story of the scriptures is that is the moment when the creator of the universe has your back.
Those are precisely the ones that God is preferential towards. Absolutely.
Yeah.
To shift a little bit, I think maybe just to alert people to something really important that happened in this week's reading is the wrestling of Jacob with the angel of the Lord. Going back to that, this ambiguous figure that is actually the Lord, but also the angel of the Lord. And there's the moment there where he is given a new name,
Yes.
which is Israel.
Which means
wrestling with God.
Wrestled with
That's
God.
right.
I was going to say that meant that he
Not a trick
wrestled with
question.
God.
He
Not
who
a trick
wrestles
question.
with- right,
It
yeah,
means
yeah.
wrestling with God. Yeah. Rick says it means, and we're all like, is he trying to trick us?
I know. I was like, I think I know what that means.
man.
Yes.
It does mean wrestling with God, and that is what
Physical?
Yeah.
Or psychological?
Yes.
What kind of wrestling?
spiritual,
all of the
Spiritual?
above.
All of the above.
emotional. Right?
I will say my one quick spiel, and we don't have to linger on it long. It's such an amazing story. It is such an amazing story for what faith is.
They wrestle all through
They
the
wrestle
night.
all through the night, and Jacob demands to be blessed. Right? It's not
Yeah.
it's not an easy thing, and he's in to some degree. The word I'm looking for isn't mortally injured, but permanently injured.
Yeah, he walks with a limp.
He walks with a limp. I mean, this is something that takes something from him, and he takes a blessing in return. And man, if that isn't such a powerful metaphor,
So finally,
for faith,
we have an exemplar. Like what? So what is faith? Okay, it's not like how these guys run their marriages or their as their parents or anything.
Yeah.
But we how do we run our faith? We wrestle with God.
Yeah.
We wrestle through the night. We wait for the blessing.
right?
And we are changed in the process.
And we're changing
And we
the
might walk with a
process.
limp.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But the blessing of God might not mean that we have our acts all together. It might mean that we walk with a limp.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh man.
Oh,
And that happens
You're
as
preaching,
an-
Rick. You're
Oh man.
use that in a sermon soon.
What I thought was interesting is that happens in an interlude in this. He's on his way to make up with his brother, but he's sent people ahead, and he's spending one night before he actually himself goes to see Esau.
Yeah.
Yep.
And so it's just interesting that that night, as he's about to go make up with
This
his brother,
emotional
that's-
crescendo.
Yeah.
Now we have to wrestle with God.
Yeah.
It's like a movie.
I would have wanted a good night's sleep, honestly. I would have wanted to go to bed early.
Yes.
Yep. Let me get my rest in before I have to battle my brother tomorrow.
I was going to say, speaking of a movie, we haven't talked about Joseph and his amazing
I
Technicolor
know, good
Dreamcoat
point.
yet.
Good point. Well, yeah, maybe one way to kick that off is I was telling Rick this morning, one of our associate rectors, Tanya, had a beautiful meditation on dreams when the pastoral team met together. And I just was reflecting on how important dreams are throughout this. I mean, it begins with Jacob and others, and Laban. God comes to Laban in a dream, not to kill Jacob. But with Joseph, right, these dreams that he has at an early age about his brothers, and then interpreting dreams in Egypt, and how important dreams and visions are throughout these stories.
Yeah. How does God speak to us?
Yeah.
Right? Well, sometimes it's in a story. Sometimes it's in a book. Sometimes it's when we're asleep.
Yeah.
Sometimes the angel of the Lord comes for a little wrestling session. Yeah. Right? Like it's not one way. There's no one way to be approached by this God.
Right.
That was also something about the way that God's interacting with people. I noticed the slight beginning of a shift as we move into the Joseph story and throughout it, where we're hearing God's direct voice less.
Yeah.
And so that was an interesting thing to notice. Like, much of the story of Joseph has nothing to do, not that it has nothing to do with God, but like it kind of has nothing to do with God.
God is not an active character in the story in the ways that God is in previous sections of the story.
Yeah.
In fact, if you watch Joseph in the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, there is no God character.
Wow.
There is no, like, you couldn't put on a play about Noah without a God character.
Right.
You couldn't put on a play about Jacob without having a God character come in and wrestle him.
Yeah.
You can put on an entire Broadway production on the Joseph story without a God character. God's there. Joseph references God.
Yep.
Joseph prays.
They pray. Yep.
But God is not a character in the same way. And I liken it to the same way that we saw in the early chapters of Genesis, that the ages of the characters, they start out at like they're living 900 years, and they're living 800 years, and they're living 500 years, and they're living 120, and that's it.
Yep.
That the further we get from Eden, that the theological meaning there is that life is not as abundant. Here, the further we get from Eden, God is a little further removed from us.
Right.
Like, there is some consequence to what happened in Eden. God's still there, but God will start acting through intermediaries like Moses and Isaiah and etc.
Well, and interestingly enough, not to jump ahead, but when you get to the beginning of Exodus, there's almost this sense of like God has forgotten, and again, this language
years will go by,
hundreds of years, and then there's this language of God remembers, God hears, God saw, and then decides. So
but we can't get to Egypt without Joseph.
That's right.
And this is the whole reason we have this crazy story about the boy with the dreams whose brothers can't stand how gloaty he can be and sell him off instead of killing him, thank goodness.
Yeah.
Joseph is a continuation of the earlier family stories of dysfunction.
Yes.
Right. I mean,
so much dysfunction in this.
Wild dysfunction. But the Joseph story has a purpose to get the narrative to Egypt. Because we got to get to Egypt in order to get out of Egypt.
Yeah.
And there's where
this is how we got here.
The juice is.
And part of it is to save the people from the famine, right? There's as he interprets the dreams of Pharaoh, it's that there's this huge famine coming, and it's not just hitting Egypt, it's hitting the lands just outside of Egypt where
the whole world
is in famine. Yeah.
Right.
So now through Joseph's turmoils, God has got Joseph in place to save the world, and in particular to save this very important family, 70 of whom end up in Egypt. They're very specific about 70 of them in Egypt.
Right.
And also it's probably worth saying, because we haven't mentioned this, that part of this story, the purpose, right, is to explain the 12 tribes of Israel.
Yes.
That the sons of Israel, Jacob, right?
There's 12
there's 12 of them, and these are their names, and these are the names of the tribes of Israel. So that's probably worth mentioning as well. Right?
And you get at the end of Genesis, if you read just a little ahead, again, as I said, we're not quite there in our reading, but we're going to talk about it. When we get to, as Jacob is dying, he's got like this whole blessing that he does. And
he sort of blesses.
But he sort of also condemns.
Yes.
There's some real interesting stuff right at the end there. I was like, I knew that was going to come back to bite Reuben. It's interesting to see there how that.
Well, and it is very interesting because there's an extremely decisive shift in chapter 49 where you're reading this narrative. And I know this wasn't technically part of this week's reading, so this is actually, I guess, a look ahead. But you get this poetry about the tribes of Israel, and kind of describing, this is what you're like, this is what will happen to you, this is what will define you. Some are longer, some are literally one quick line, which is interesting unto itself, but kind of tells a story about how even if we're going to continue to talk about these things as maybe being written later than the actual story, it's giving an explanation for why the 12 tribes of Israel are the way that they are. Right?
It's describing them as they were then, as they're being written down, every bit as much as it's describing them.
It talks about like
before.
Simeon and Levi get divided into two different, because they were angry, so they have to be divided, and somebody else ends up on the shoreline, and and Judah gets this long, lengthy blessing, and all I could think in my head was, "And you, Bethlehem of Judah," and then sort of later on in the Gospels.
Yep, absolutely. Maybe one thing to wrap us up, because we've been going a minute here, but one thing to wrap us up is, speaking of moving lines of this week's reading, again, I'm cognizant that people did not actually read the very end of Genesis, but that line that I feel like is so famous in churches and Christian history, that Joseph says to his brothers at the very end, and he says, this is verse 19 of chapter 50. But Joseph said to them, "Do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God? Even though you intended to do harm to me, God intended it for good in order to preserve a numerous people as he is doing today." And that sense of what you meant for harm, God has used for good, which is, again, something that the New Testament uses. Paul kind of says something similar in Romans, right? It's a powerful line.
Yeah. We probably should say, like, the brothers beat Joseph up and threw him down a well, and then sold him into slavery.
And selling him into slavery and throwing him down the well was Reuben negotiated down from murder.
Right. So when we talk about what you intended for evil, that was the evil.
Right.
And it says out of that,
I stubbed my toe.
And they knew that and they knew he was alive. They knew he'd been sold into slavery, not killed. And they told their father that he was dead. And their father was devastated.
And they just let him go.
A fact that lingers through the whole rest of the story. Like how devastated Jacob was comes up again.
Over and over.
Yeah.
Right. And yet, because they did that, Joseph is there to save the world, interpret Pharaoh's dreams, and then get the.
He has that whole situation in Potiphar's house because he has to end up in the jail so that he can interpret those people's dreams so that he can end up Pharaoh's second-hand man.
He makes it to the gutter, he is as low as he can go, so that he can be in the right place to save the world. Yeah.
Which I think, we don't have to go down the rabbit hole. I think an important theological point here to be made for today is, I think when I have heard, I don't know about you two, but when I've heard people use this, there's very much a sense of God created this evil thing in my life to actually do good from it. There's almost the sense of God is the cause of the evil and the good. And I might want to push back a little bit and say, I think actually part of this story is that we don't have to attribute these evil things that happened to Joseph to God's will, that we can very much leave it on the level of this is things his brothers did, that these slave traders did, etc. And that this is actually a story about God's restorative action in the midst of evil. And I think that might sound like a very fine distinction, but the distinction is that
really important.
Yeah, the distinction is that when evil is happening, we do not say this evil is God's will. We can actually look at it and say this is not the will of God, and in fact, even despite it, God is able to work good within it. Which is very different than saying this
God
evil
caused
thing.
It so that something
God
else
caused this evil thing so that good could come out of it. It's no.
God
used what was happening.
Yes.
Very, very. It might seem fine to some listeners, but I think it's a really important theological distinction that saves us from saying things about God that are kind of evil. Evil.
And then assuming things about people's lives and what they should or shouldn't do, or who they should or shouldn't be.
Yeah.
It can be really, it can lead you down a really dangerous path.
Right.
If you think that the evil that's happened, God did on purpose.
Mm-hmm.
God caused because of something else.
Right.
Too many people have been so hurt or felt as though they had to stay in hurtful places because, well, God intended this for you. God will see you through. It's like, I really, truly do not believe that God is
breaks your heart over and over
breaks
again.
your heart intentionally over and over in some of these ways.
As Christian, I will say, as Christian readers of Scripture, kind of our mediating lens should be good news, right? I mean, this is how Jesus reads the Scriptures, and I think that is not a message of good news that you just articulated, Natalie. It is very much that if that was in fact true, that would be very bad
But to
news.
say that this place that you've ended up, which is terrible and awful and at rock bottom, that God can even bring you out of that something good can come out of it, not because it was intended to originally,
right?
But because there's always hope in the midst of despair. And that's good news.
That's good news. Right. And it brings us full circle to what you said at the start, Rick, that these are the people that God is caring for and looking out for and providing for. The people that are in the hard spot are the Hagar, the foreign thing, the second born, the weak one, the poor. So, yeah.
Ooh. Yeah.
Good stuff.
Well, on that note, I think this is a great place to wrap up for the day.
Yeah.
And so thank you all for listening in. Enjoy the rest of Genesis and get started on Exodus. We're going to have a great episode for you next week.
All right. See you soon.
Bye. Thank you for listening to this episode of Cross Connections Cover to Cover. New episodes drop each Wednesday. Please be sure to follow or like us on your favorite podcasting app to find us easily each week, or join us on our email list at stdavidschurch.org/crossconnections. If you have questions for us, you can call us at 484-588-5656 and leave a voicemail with your name, where you're from, and your question or comment. Please note, we may use your recorded voice in an upcoming episode of Cross Connections. If you like what you hear, we'd love if you would share this with your friends and rate us in Spotify and Apple Podcasts or whatever other app you're using so people can find us as well. Don't forget to visit our show notes for the year's reading list and any other resource links we've mentioned. Cross Connections is a ministry of St. David's Episcopal Church in Wayne, Pennsylvania. Season 2 Cover to Cover is hosted by
Rick Morley,
Elliot VanHoy,
and Natalee Hill. Logo, graphic design, and podcast production by Natalee Hill. Stock media music provided by Marscott and MoodMode Pond 5. You're welcome to learn more about all of St. David's worship and ministries at stdavidschurch.org.